Okay, so today we begin on Ayin Dalid Amin Aleph, the very bottom, in fact, the very last words, um, and we'll then turn the page and hopefully get to the Mishnah. But again, we're at that phase now where we are reviewing uh, the last several segments of the Mishnah that we had on Ayin Beis Amid Beis. Ayin Beis Amid Beis. We had the Mishnah where we went through a number of different circumstances as to whether or not you're allowed to engage in a contract to pay and if for in other words, you're paying and getting something in the future. It's called future contracts, and whether or not you'll get exactly what you bargained for, because if you get more, it's ribbis. In other words, your it's depending on the price fluctuation, it would be considered ribbis unless it is an exception, as we say, Yotza Hashar, where there's an established price, or Yeshlo, where you have something in your possession. And the objective being, if you have something in your possession, then you're not really betting on the come because you already technically have it, even though it's not yours yet, but it could be yours. So again, there's a leniency here because of commerce. That's the whole point. The whole point is that we want to facilitate that there should be commerce and not make it more difficult by putting obstacles of ribbis and all these other things in front of it. So again, it's very consistent. The Gemara is very consistent, and the halacha is very consistent, that we try to do everything we can to facilitate that commerce should go on. All right. So we're now at the bottom of Ayin Daled Amid Aleph, and the Gemara it's by the two dots. Okay, the Gemara says, "Posek ima ala zevel kol yemos hashana." So the Mishnah was talking about whether or not how you can engage in the purchase of fertilizer, and we'll see exactly why specifically they mention fertilizer, but buying fertilizer where you can purchase the fertilizer for future delivery, and says the Mishnah says that you can engage in the action of purchasing fertilizer all year round because it's plentiful, right? I mean, it's an ongoing plentiful supply. As long as you have the animals and all, then fertilizer is a natural product. So that is the Tanna Kama. The Tanna Kama says that, and we have a machlokes on the Tanna Kama that and Rabbi Yossi says that that you can't just enter into a contract unless you have the fertilizer available now. So the Tanna Kama says you can, and this is important. Tanna Kama says you can engage in purchasing fertilizer all year because it's plentiful. Good morning, Svi. Rabbi Yossi says that the only time you can, from the Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi says the only time you can do it is if you actually have the yeshlo, you have the fertilizer, and the Chachamim say it's okay. We'll understand in a minute what this interchange is. We have three parties. We have the Tanna Kama, it was Rab Meir. We have Rabbi Yossi, and then you have the Chachamim. Frek the Gemara, Chachamim hana Tanna Kama. So the third position, where the Chachamim say it's okay without being specific, l'chara, that's the same as the Tanna Kama. Tanna Kama says you can engage in the purchase of fertilizer all year round because it's plentiful. Rabbi Yossi is the one who puts a caveat and says, no, you have to have it. And the Chachamim say, no, it's okay. So what's the Chiddush? In other words, we asked what's the Chiddush of the Chachamim if the Tanna Kama already says the same thing? So in other words, what's going on here? There must be some reason why the Gemara is bringing the Chachamim down, even though the Tanna Kama seem to say the same thing. Omar Rava. So now Rava is going to distinguish and explain to us why there is the need to mention the Tanna Kama and the Chachamim. What is the chiluk? Yemoisa geshamim ika benayu. That the difference between the Tanna Kama and the Chachamim is in the rainy season. In other words, there's a difference between the purchase of zevel of fertilizer in the dry season, meaning winter, or the summer season. Memela, according to Rabbi Yossi, he says you have to have it mamish like yeshlo. Okay, then we're not worried about it. But what about where you can do it for the entire year? What's the chilik? So the Gemara says geshamim yeshlo. So what's pshat geshamim? So so we have to understand that from what I guess that's the way the society worked, is that the fertilizer that was produced, because fertilizer is produced year round. I mean, there isn't it's the animals produce it, whether it's winter or summer. The difference is that in the winter, which is the rainy season, the fertilizer was left out in the field, and it was, I guess, the rain, the snow, everything made it more
liquidy,
easier for people to use, because otherwise it would be hard. So by having the rain and the snow and everything else, it became more advantageous to engage in the purchase of the. I mean, you can buy it in the winter, but it's going to be hard to use because it's rain and all. So in the summer, when everything was already trampled and wet and everything else, then it became better to use it. So now, based on that, there's now these opinions of the Tanna Kama and the Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim. That so according to the Tanna Kama, even though the fertilizer is not usable, so technically yeshlo doesn't apply, because yeshlo means that you have the fertilizer and you can sell it and it's ready to be used. That you can't say that in the winter season. There, the Tanna Kama says it's okay as long as you have the physical zevel, then you can engage, even though it's not optimal, because it's not usable, it's not soft, it's not manageable. So according to the Tanna Kama, yesh lo applies even in the rainy season, because it's there. And as the concept of yesh lo, according to the Tanna Kama, doesn't necessarily mean that it's fully ready to be used. It means that he has it so you can transact, you can buy it. Anybody who buys it will say, okay, I can't use it right away because it's not yet malleable, it's not yet as usable. So Tanna Kama says, no, it's okay. Rabbi Yossi says, no, that you have to have it, regardless of whether it is summer season, winter season. You have to have the supply in order to have yeshlo. Come the Chachamim, and the Chachamim say, no, you know what? That you can, we can make a pshara. So you have two different opinions. If you have the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Yossi, Chachamim come and they make a compromise between the Tanna Kama and Rabbi Yossi, and they say that that even though you don't have the zevel to use in the rainy season because it's not yet mature, somewhere, and again, this is an open-ended thing, someone has it and it's usable. In other words, you could be sitting here in Silver Spring and you can't usually use the fertilizer because it's not yet softened, it's not yet ready. So then, if you can't use it, then according to Tanakama, Yeshlo still applies. According to Rabbi Yossi, it doesn't apply. Comes the Chachamim, and they say, you know what? We will allow you to engage in the purchase of the Zevel, even though it's not available here, because Yeshlo applies somewhere else. But but um, but in the rainy season, according to the Chachamim, you have to have it literally with you. In other words, you can't rely on Yeshlo because you don't know if someone else is going to have it. So what he's trying to say is that there is a chiddush between the Chachamim and the Tanakama because the Tanakama um, is very liberal and says you can engage in the contracting of the Zevel any time of the year, regardless of whether it's winter or summer. According to Rabbi Yossi, no, he says depending on whether it is winter or summer, there is the requirement of there has to be you have to have it physically in your possession, not somewhere else, because it may not be available somewhere else. And they come the Chachamim and say, you know what? No, we're going to allow you to engage in the purchase of the Zevel in the winter season, the rainy season, when it's not available here, because somewhere else it's available and there is a yeshlo. So that's how the Gemara wants to answer. That's why we have all three, because you have the extremes of Tanakama on one end, Rabbi Yossi on the other end, and the Chachamim come and want to try to compromise between them. That's oftentimes we see that is that you bridge the gap. You have a third shita that bridges the gap, and here that's what we're saying is that in the winter season, when it's not available because it's not soft and malleable, then according to the Chachamim, it's okay. According to the Chachamim, you're allowed to enter into a contract. And Mamela, Rabbi Yossi doesn't enter the picture here because Rabbi Yossi says you always have to have it physically present. The only question is does Yeshlo somewhere else apply? Does it apply to somewhere else? And the according to the Chachamim, they would allow it. Um, According to the Tanakama, they would allow it, and Rabbi Yossi said, and the Chachamim make a distinction as between the winter season and the summer season. So those are the three differences. That Rabbi Yossi is the most machmir, and the Tanakama is the most makel, and the Chachamim are in the middle. They say that it sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. In any event, that's the chiddush of why the Mishnah talks about Zevel, is because we don't have this kind of discussion or argument in any of the other circumstances. When we talked about last week, we talked about the barrels of wine or the olives or whatever it happens to be. Each one is identified in the Mishnah for a particular reason because it's different than the others. So this is why he mentions Zevel, because it's different than the others. Okay. So and again, so there would be no ribbis question in these situations because of the yeshlo. So now it depends. According to Rabbi Yossi, you can't engage in it would potentially be ribis unless you have it in your possession. That's what Biosi is being machmir in saying, no, no, you can't enter into a an agreement for the future purchase of the zevel unless you actually have it. Because if you don't have it, then there is the problem of ribis. So that's why
Excuse,
ribis is the issue here, is because the machlokes is whether or not you can engage in a contract for the future purchase depending on which man armor you hold, like the Tanakama or the Chachamim or Rabbi Yossi. All right,
excuse,
so
excuse me,
that's the thing.
Rabbi.
Yeah, Jay.
Uh, is there an assumption here that no matter what time of the year you get the fertilizer from the animals that are part of somebody's farm, that it will soften up if you just wait long enough? I mean, it's not going to stay hard forever. So if
Right.
there's an assumption that it will always become usable, even if it's later, why should there be a distinction because it's not ready today versus 2 months from now?
Oh, so that's a good question. So Rabbi Yossi's position is, notwithstanding that it may become malleable in the future, right? Because you're saying that more likely than not, he is saying that, but how do you know it's going to be available to you? In other words, okay, I agree that there will come a time in the season when it will be ripe and ready to go. But how do you know that you will be able to get your hands on it at that point in time? There may be a shortage, or there may, in other words, he wants to ensure that from day one, you're going to be able to
Well,
transact.
that's why he buys futures to make sure he gets it. I mean, if
Right.
there are animals, you're going to have it.
If animals are going to have it, but the question is, will there be? No, no. You will have it. The question is, will there be enough?
So volume is a question.
Volume is a question that Rabbi Yossi says, I can't rely that there will be volume for you to do the purchase later, and therefore the price may go up, and therefore there may be ribbons. In other words, he's
Why would he go to that question of uncertainty and volume? The animals are alive. They're going to produce the same amount of
so
fertilizer every day.
so maybe that Rabbi Yossi experienced situations where it wasn't available. So he
Okay.
said, if there's a possibility that it's not available, I'm not going to allow it because I've already seen situations where it's not available. So
Okay.
basically may not be plucking it out of thin air. He may be saying it based on actuality that there was,
There's always going to be limits. I mean, you have a farmer, let's say, there's
yeah.
sort of a balance, supply and demand of how things work out. And then some farmer all of a sudden, for whatever reason, maybe he always got it from the next town over, and this time he can't. And all of a sudden he needs, hundreds of pounds of this stuff. And there just isn't, even though there is supply in that town, there just isn't enough. So,
But I thought
So Rabbi,
the
so Rabbi,
buyer, I
yeah,
thought the buyer is buying it from the farmer who has the animals.
but
Why?
that doesn't mean necessarily that
that
there's
the supply
enough.
will be there when he needs it.
Maybe the farmer's already got it committed to others. So,
Right.
Had cattle diseases and the animals could die.
Exactly. So Rabbi Yossi, because he's so makbid that the ribbis issue will come to bite him, says, I don't want any chance. No chance
Okay.
whatsoever. Yeah, there may be enough cows, there may be enough supply, but that doesn't guarantee that you're going to be able to get it at the price that you negotiated today. Therefore, I'm a machmer. In other words, I strictly, it's a strict constructionist who says, I don't want any wiggle room. I don't want any possibilities. Now, you're right. 99.9% of the time, there'll be enough animals. There'll be enough going forward. It'll be fine. But Rabbi Yossi, in his position, either experienced it or says, I can't take a chance. So, in other words, he's just a machmir. Rabbi Yossi is a machmir.
Yeah.
But the
Okay.
point is that you see from this experience that there are moving parts here that may affect how that purchase is going to happen. The weather, um, the scarcity of the animals, the fact that that I hate to say this, but maybe the animals will be they'll be constipated. They won't be able to do what they have to do. In other words, again, it's a nature thing. It's not, you don't just churn it out. You don't manufacture it. It has to happen, and 90%, 99% it will happen. But Rabbi Yossi says I can't rely unless there is not yeshlo somewhere else. You have to have it in your possession, and then let the rainy season make it soft and ready. Then I know you'll have it. So and that's a chiddush in this case that we don't see in the other cases. In other words, that's why this particular case is mentioned in the Mishnah, is because there is no parallel in the other cases that we've experienced or the last one that we're going to talk about. So, but you see how makbid and as the machlekes is. I mean, Jay, you asked why would Rabbi Yossi be so concerned? It's more than likely, highly likely that he's going to have enough to be able to. There'll be enough to go around, and the pricing won't affect. But I guess if you have the slightest whim of a doubt, you can't enter it. And that's Rabbi Yossi's view, as maybe as unrealistic as it is, but Rabbi Yossi's position does stay there. And again, the machlokes between the Tanna and the Chachamim depends on whether or not you are able to as to whether or not you allow the fact that the winter season will prepare it in time, and you do or don't have the availability. And as Menashe said, it may be available somewhere else, but that somewhere else may not be accessible to you, right? So
Could,
you'll
could
be
they
a
have
shortage. Somewhere else will have it, but that doesn't mean that you'll have it.
could they have written the purchase order with conditions, provided this or provided that it's available when the time comes?
They
Would they have Chachamim would have allowed a contract with a condition?
Hold the thought, because that what you're suggesting is a discussion in this next piece of Gemara, not exactly the way you say it, but yes, the answer is that there would be room to negotiate in the contract for some kind of circumstance that you're talking about. So let's talk about
Okay.
that now,
Thank
because
you.
again, it's not hard and fast. There are ways to possibly get around it. So now let's say, um, okay, so the last piece of the Mishnah tells us what? Last piece of the Mishnah tells us that uposek imo b'shar hagavua, that the buyer can negotiate with the seller at the very outset that it's almost a generic contract. He'll say, I want the best price that is available at the time. I want the best price that I can at the time. Otherwise, I won't buy it. In other words, I'm buying it at $50 a say a bushel, whatever the product is. And if it's not 50, and if it turns out to be at $35, you have to sell it to me for $35, or else I have an out that I don't have to um, uh,
Go through
uh,
with the okay.
finalize the contract. In other words, what you're saying, Jay, is yes, everything is you can negotiate. You're not locked in to say this is the only way the contract can work. That's why I say it's not quite the same, but it's the thought now that after everything is said and done, and we've engaged in contracts, and we're saying yeshlo, we're going to wait, and everything else, the mission is telling us, but at the very end of the day, if you say that you have to say the words. The magic words are that Posek Imo Bishar Hagavoa, he negotiates with him for the best price. If that's the negotiation, then If the price changes, then he can say, you've got to sell it to me at the lower price. Otherwise, I can get out of the contract, and that's fair. That's legitimate. You can negotiate a deal that way. So now this last piece really sort of overshadows everything we've been discussing till now, because until now we were talking about contracts where you're locked in, and the question is whether or not yeshlo or whether it was a shar. In other words, we were talking about a structure because the two parties had a fixed agreement. This last segment basically blows that away because it says, yeah, the agreement we have, either I get the best price or if it changes in prices, I don't have to make a deal. So now you have a complete out that you don't even have to, you're not fixed to the deal that you're making because that better be the deal at the end of the day. Otherwise, there's no deal. So that this is now a different chiddush, a different twist on the discussion of whether or not you can enter into a contract for the future, because you're basically saying, I'm entering into the contract, but if that isn't the price, there is no contract. So, and that's very different than what we've been saying till now. Okay, so that's what the Mishnah tells us. Now we're going to sort of take that apart. Says the Gemara as follows. Hahu Gavra, okay, this is the following incident that we're going to have a discussion on. Hahu Gavra Diov Zuzeh, a person brought his money and he gave the money to the seller of items that were lignude debe chamua, that would go into his father-in-law's dowry. What does this mean? This means that Moshe was going to get married to Yaakov's daughter. So Moshe went out and he bought items, jewelry, other things for the dowry, and then he gave it to presumably the father-in-law gave him the money, but he then gave it to the father-in-law for the dowry. It's a kind of unusual situation, but that's what it was. The father-in-law said to the future son-in-law, "Go ahead and buy these items, and it'll be part of my daughter's dowry." The sof zal gedunya. At the end, after the purchase of all these items, they decreased in price, right? Zal, they became cheaper. So now he entered into a deal with the seller of these items, and now they're cheaper. So now it's going to border on our situation. So, and he wanted to come back, and he came back to the seller and said, the stuff that I bought from you is now cheaper. Give me the cheaper price. And the seller said to him, "No, we made a deal. You bought it, and that's it. I can't help if it became cheaper after the fact." Also, the comment of, and this is a fairly standard kind of case because it happens all the time. Not necessarily that the guy will go back and ask for the better price, but this kind of situation happens where you buy something and it becomes devalued, right? You buy diamonds, and now the diamond market is soft, and the diamonds are worth half the price, and you say, I don't want to pay $1,000 a carat. I want to pay $500 a carat. So again, not an atypical case, but the question now becomes, as we'll see, did they articulate in the discussion that I'm going to buy it only for the best price? If the price changes, I want to have the opportunity of the lower price, or I want out. Also, the comment of Rav Papa. So they came to Rav Papa, and Rav Papa was the Paisik, and they say, what are the options here? Can he get out of the deal? Can he get not out of the deal? Does the seller have to give him the discounted price or not? Omale, so Rav Papa said to the parties, I pasakti imo b'shar hagavoa. Now, if you said the magic words that you want to negotiate a price that will be the best price. Now, again, the Gemara doesn't tell us specifically over what period of time. This is not open-ended. You can come back 2 years later. So Mistama, we're talking about, as we do in our situation where we see all the time, advertisements. We're selling something, but if the price changes in 30 days, you're allowed to come back and get a better price, right? That advertisement you see oftentimes in stores, that they want to make sure that you're comfortable, that buy from me, because if the price goes down, I'll give you the better price. Okay, not knowing whether there'll be a better price or not, but so that's kind of the situation here. So within a reasonable time, he came back. So Rav Papa said, "I posakti mo b'shar gavoa." If when you were negotiating, as you said, Jay, can I negotiate? Of course you can negotiate. And I say, you know what? If this price it changes in 60 days, I want the better price. Then Shoko Bahashta, then he can get the lower price, the Hashta, the price now, which is the lower price. Ve'ilo, but if he didn't stipulate and negotiate that I want the better price, Shoko Kimiyakara, then you have to accept the original price. So Rav Papa is being sort of pragmatic by saying, you know what? If you can do whatever you want. But as long as you speak it out, you have to negotiate it. You can't just say, "Oh, I meant to say such and such." That doesn't count. You have to say it. If you say it, and again, we're assuming here that it either was a writing or the parties had an oral agreement, which was acceptable. And there were witnesses. In other words, we know that it's real. If we know that it's real, and he said that I want the best price, then if the price goes down within that period of time, whatever it is, the Gemara isn't specific, then you can get it. So now Rav Papa basically gave the psak based on our Mishnah. What? Our Mishnah said that. Posikim b'shar gavoa. If you negotiate up front for the best price, then you get the best price, right? Then okay, fine. Now the Mishnah, which we didn't speak out, which we'll just say it for a moment, is that so that is the Mishnah. There was a Manda Omer Rabbi Yehuda who said, "Afal b'shel pasuk imu b'shar gavoa," even though he didn't speak out, he still has the option of backing out. So that was, again, that's Rav Papa's not addressing that, but there was a machlokes between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda said, "No, you don't have to speak out." But Rav Papa is learning pshat like the Tanakama, that you have to speak out in order for there to be a option to get a better price. Okay.
Isn't it, can you say the assumption is everybody always wants a better price?
Hold the thought, because inherently that seems to be something that the Gemara will address.
Okay.
Is a condition, right? I mean, we're only talking about, they're saying de jure, you have to do something. You can't, it's, in other words, kumva aseh, you got to do something
Yeah.
in order to, otherwise, the problem is if there's always, at least from now, at this point in time, if there is a thought that that should always be the case, what will that do to commerce? Once again, commerce is going to be upended because there will be no certainty in commerce. At least if I negotiate with you and we have a deal, I know we have a deal. If the deal says that if there's a better price, I got to give it to you, that's the deal. But but you have to have a certain kind of certainty that not something is going to come out of left field and blow the whole deal away at some point in time. So that's why I say hold the thought, because we're gonna think about that maybe a little bit as part of the condition. But right now we're not thinking of inherent in every deal is the thought that I want the best price. You want the best price. Some people don't care for the best price. There are actually people who will go out and buy it and said, "Fine, I'm happy with the price I paid. I paid a good price. I'm not worried about it." So that's the circumstance that Rav Papa is dealing with, and Rav Papa is saying, yeah, if you speak it out, you have the option. If you don't, then you got to pay the price. Okay.
I'm following.
So now we see Rav Papa holds like the Tanakh in the Mishnah. Frek the Gemara, Amalei Rabbanon Rav Papa. So the Rabbanon came to Rav Papa and they said to him, V'ilo posuk shakol b'miyukara. And if he did not um, uh,
Specifying.
if he didn't articulate it, why should that be a problem? Not for the reason that you mentioned, Jay, but for another reason. Why? Mos Ninu. We're talking about where he gave him the money. He gave him the money and he said, I'm going to buy this diamond. And he didn't say, but it should be for the best price. Why should that be a problem? The Rabbanan hold umo'us lo kani, that money alone. Remember, we had this discussion: is money the determining factor, or do you have to have a kinyan?
Right.
And here you don't have a kinyan yet. The kinyan will come at the end. So then technically this deal is suspended until the kinyan happens. So what difference does it make if he speaks out, oh, I want the best price? It doesn't matter, not for your reason, Jay, but because there's no deal yet. Right? Remember, we had exclusions that if there was a certain, like in the diamond industry, there's a handshake, and the handshake is a kinyan. We had those exclusions where in a place where something other than a direct kinyan seals the deal, then like b'minig, then that minig applies. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about here where he went ahead and he gave him the money and he said, okay, and didn't say, I want the best deal. And then it turns out that there was a devaluation. And so according to the Chacham, according to the Rabbanan, there's no deal. You don't need to have. So how can you, Rav Papa Paskin, that the whole everything turns on whether or not he spoke out and said, I want the best deal? The Rabbanan say, no, it's not dependent on what he said. It's dependent on whether you had a kinyan, and here you didn't have a kinyan. So that's the kasha of the Rabbanan on Rav Papa's ruling, is that according to us, Rabbanan, according to the majority of the rabbis, there's no deal here. So how can you paskin that there is a deal? That's what they asked Rav Papa. So Amalahu, so Rav Papa said to the Rabbanan, Anonami lekabula ani mishapara ko'amina. I don't disagree with you, Rabbanan. I agree that there is a potential option because it's money and money isn't a kinyan. What I mean to say, says Rav Papa, is what about the mishapara? Remember that what we said was that if you enter into a deal and you can argue that that deal isn't finalized because there's no kinyan, if you back out, you back out at your peril because there's a mishapara. And we talked about the mishapara being something that people were very wary of, which is why deals were enforced even though there wasn't necessarily a kinyan because of the mishapara. So Rav Papa is answering and saying, you know what? What I meant to say when I said that there was a solid deal, I said I was referring to the mishapara portion of the deal. That's what I meant. I posik bishar hagavoa. If so, this is what he meant to say. If the parties stipulated for the best price, right, and then the buyer comes back and the seller says, no, no way, you made a deal. Mocha kohoda bay, then the seller is the one who is backing out because he doesn't want to refund makabele mocha mishapara. Then the seller is the one who has to make the mishapara because he refuses to back out of the deal. So we put the onus on him. If he'll make the mishapara, we'll allow him to have the deal. But again, the mishapara was enough to scare people away. So that would be sort of the hook that they would be able to say, all right, the deal is off because of the mishapara. Elo Pasuk. But what happens if the parties did not, if the buyer did not say, I want the best price? So he's kind of on the hook here. Then Lokeach Gahodebe. It's the buyer who wants to undo the deal because the price became lower. Makabele Lokeach Mishapara. Then the buyer has to do the Mishapara. So Rav Papa is saying, you know what? Not that the deal can't fall apart. Potentially the deal can't fall apart, but the onus of the Mishapara is what's going to make the difference as to whether or not someone will want to back out of the deal. Because the Mishapara was a very severe sort of restriction that most people did not want to cross. So he's saying, sure, someone can break the deal even without speaking out. I'm not going to, in other words, I'm not going to say no, but I'm going to say that the whole thing is Tolia Mishapara, and therefore, when I gave the psak, I meant to say that the Mishapara, if you speak out, then the Mishapara falls on the seller. If you don't speak out and then you want to renege, the Mishapara falls on the buyer. So Rav Papa is kind of sort of, I guess, negotiating here that my halacha didn't deal with the hard and fact, can you get out of the deal? It dealt with the Mishapara portion, whether or not you can get out of the deal. And therefore, that's why he said what he said, because Rav Papa was of the view that 99.9% of people will not want to cross the Mishapara. They won't want to sort of put upon themselves that situation. So it was akin to saying, no, you can't get out of the deal. But technically, he's saying you can if you're willing to accept the Mishapara. So that's how Rav Papa answers the Rabbanan. Because remember, the Rabbanan had a good question. Why do you even say that that's the halacha? Money doesn't acquire the property. You have to have a kinyan. So Rav Papa is saying, I agree with you, Rabbanan. It isn't hard and fast 100%. It's 99% because of the Mishapara, not because the money, you're right, the money didn't make the kinyan, but Mishapara is what makes the difference. So that's where we are, that Rav Papa is saying my psak is based on the inyan of the Mishapara. Okay, fine, it's a good answer, and that understands the Mishnah. But we're not there yet. Omale Ravina Rav Papa. So Ravina says to Rav Papa, okay, you just got through saying that your psak is okay because even though you can hold like the Rabbanon, that there's no kinyan here. If there's no kinyan here, then why do you even make that psak? The answer is, Rav Papa says, I make the psak because of the Mishapara. Amalei Ravina Rav Papa. So Ravina then says to Rav Papa, Umimai, how do we know that Rav Papa holds like the Rabbanan? Remember, the Rabbanan came and said, why, Rav Papa, do you even have a Havamina to give that psak? It's only about the money, and money is not kaina. So Rav Papa answers, you're right, money is not kaina, but we're talking about Mishapara. Comes Ravina and says, no, Rav Papa, there's no raya you hold like the Rabbanan that money is that because money isn't kaina. Amalei Ravina Rav Papa umimai. How do you know the Rabbanan he depligated Rav Shimon? How do you know that Rav Papa holds like the Rabbanan in the machlokes between the Rabbanan and Rav Shimon? If you remember, many dafim ago, there was a machlokes between the Rabbanan and Rav Shimon as to whether or not money is kaina. Rabbanan said money is not kaina, and Rav Shimon said money is kaina. That remember that because what we said about the minhagim, right? That where money is used as a kinyan, even though it isn't mashiach or hagbah, it's allowed. That was the machlokes. Says Ravina, how do you know that Rav Papa holds like Rabbanan? The Amra Mos Eina Kaina, who says that Mos is not Kaina, and therefore the whole Indian has to do with the Mishapara. Vafilo hoche iposik b'shar gavoa, and so he's repeating. And even though he did not speak out the best price, shakel kidahashta, then he can take the cheaper price, right? Elo posak, but if he didn't, then shakel midiyakara. In other words, how do you hold like the Rabbanan, and therefore you can say that the difference is whether he spoke out or not, right? Because that's what Rav Papa says because of the Mishapara. Dilma Rab Shimon he. Maybe really Rav Papa holds like Rab Shimon, the Amamos Konos, that Mos is Kone, right? And if Mos is Kone, then V'chi Posik B'shar Gavoa, if he says specifically the price, shakel ki hashta, then he has to take the price as it is. Ilo posek shakel b'mikara, but if he did not say in the beginning, I want the best price, mishum dekana lezuze, because the money in effect sealed the deal. So in other words, you can even hold like Reb Shimon, says Ravina. You don't have to hold like Rabbanan and say the machlekes is about Mishapara. You could, I guess the Gemara here is trying to say, who does Rav Papa's psak hold like? Remember, when we talk about everything is sort of sequential. If there was a machlekes between Rav Shimon and the Rabbanan as to whether or not Moa is kaineh, then later on the the Amoraim who were giving psak basically can choose, right? This is before the halacha that you go after Rabbanim, which is the rabbin. So at some point in time, they had the option of saying, no, I don't hold like the Rabbanan, I hold like Reb Shimon, which at that point in time was completely legitimate because you had two Tanoim who argued. When you have two Tanoim who argue, then both sides are legitimate, and either side can be acceptable to the later generation until the Shulchan Aruch. Then we have the halacha. So here we're trying to say in the beginning that Rav Papa holds like the Rabbanan, that you're right, Mos ain't a kona. You can't make a deal. But if you don't speak out, then you'll be subject to Mishapara. So the whole machlokes is Mishapara. Says Ravina, what are you talking about? Why do you say the whole machlokes is Mishapara? Rav Papa holds like Reb Shimon. Rav Papa holds like Reb Shimon that Mos is Kone. So if Mos is Kone, forget about the Mishapara. If you spoke out, then you made an exception to the kinyan of money. You made an exception. I've made a kinyan, but I made an exception to the kinyan, and therefore you're allowed to back out. You're allowed to back out if you make exceptions. Why? Because, as I don't know, Menashe, whoever said it, or Jay, you can enter into a deal with a caveat. And the caveat is, if the price changes, I get a better deal. But if you don't say it, then the money was already koneh. Because Rab Shimon says that you made the deal from the beginning and the money was already koneh. You don't need Meshicha or Agbor or something else. In which case, Rav Papa was right when he said, if you made the deal, you can back out, even if Mos is koneh. But if you didn't make the deal, then you can't back out because Mos is koneh. So now, under Ravina's question, Rav Papa can even hold like Rav Shimon. He doesn't have to hold like the Rabbanan that Mos ain't a Kona. He can hold like Rav Shimon that Mos is Kona, right? Because Mos Kona doesn't disqualify you from backing out if you spoke it out at the beginning. That's Ravina's chap. It's a tremendous kasha because we're trying to understand when Rav Papa made his psak, who does he hold like? Right at that point in time when they came for the psak, they sat and wanted to have a shiur. Okay, Rav Papa, you're telling us so and so. What's your reason? Do you hold like Rabbanan or do you hold like Rab Shimon? Right? Today we wouldn't have that discussion. People wouldn't necessarily be engaged with the Pesach about the halacha in terms of who do you hold like from the Tanoim, because we have a halacha. But at that point in time, they were Talmidei Chachamim, and they said, "Wait a minute, Rav Papa, why do you say that?" The Rabbanan say no, and the Ravina says he doesn't have to hold like the Rabbanan; he can hold like Reb Shimon. Anyway, it's a very interesting exchange because from here we have no definitive answer who Rav Papa holds like. Does he hold like the Rabbanan, or does he hold like Reb Shimon? So, Ravina goes on. In other words, you can really hold like Reb Shimon, Aval Rabbanan. But according to the Rabbanan, who say that Mos Eina Kone, Bein Pasek, Bein Lo Pasak, Shakal Ki Hashta. Why does it matter whether he stipulated and said, I want my money back, um, that Shakal Ki Hashta, he can take the cheaper price. Why? Here, Jay, is your thought. The
Yeah.
data de inish atarta zila. A person normally, when he enters into a contract, in his mind, he says, if there's a cheaper price, I want a cheaper price. In other words, the Gemara is imputing that most people who are pragmatic, not throwing their money around, will inherently want the best price, whether they spoke it out or not.
Yeah.
So Jay, your point is that why should you have to pay that price? You should be able to back out whether you spoke it out or not, because the data inish atarta zila. Everybody thinks about the cheapest price. If I walk into a store and I'm paying $100 for an item, then, inherently my mind is going to, it seems a little expensive. I'd like to pay $75 for that item. So he's imputing that. So so Ravina says that according to the Rabbanon, who say Mos Eina Kona, as long as the gavel hasn't fallen and the deal is over, everybody thinks about paying a cheaper price,
Yeah.
right? It's kind of interesting how Ravina is saying that human nature should take over here and allow someone to back out of the original deal because he thought it, and that if you thought it, that's enough.
Well,
So
some
that,
people today go into a store and say, okay, I'm interested in that thing. I need your best price.
oh,
They
but
start in right away with the best price.
right. But let's say he goes into the store and he's a shy guy, right? So I wouldn't necessarily go to the storekeeper and say, "Oh, this is beautiful. I love it. It's $100. I'll pay $100." I'm not going to say to the storekeeper, but if it's cheaper, I really want it cheaper. Now, we Jews are known to negotiate, so we're always negotiating, and the likelihood is that at the outset of the deal, we probably negotiated and said, I want a better price, and the seller said, no, it's got to be this price. So he pays the price, but in the back of his mind, he says, no, 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 I really want a better price than this. So this now goes to human nature. Says Ravina that according to Rabbanan, human nature would take over, and since you haven't, everybody admits if the gavel falls, the deal is over. I can't undo the deal. Okay, that's the way it is. In other words, I I made a kinyan, and I'm a Torah Jew, and the Torah says you have to, if you make a kinyan, you make a kinyan, the deal's over. Okay, I have no brera. I can't undo the deal. But if I don't make a kinyan and I hold like the Rabbanan that Mos and Akona, wait a minute, I can now come back and renegotiate. Says Ravina, that's why, according to, this is the Chiddush, if Rav Papa held like the Rabbanan, you don't need psikta, you don't need speaking out. Even without speaking out, it's okay because according to the Rabbanan, everybody has in mind that they want a better price. So that's the kasha on Rav Papa. You want to say you hold like the Rabbanan? No, Ravina says. You really hold like Rab Shimon. What do you do with the Rabbanan? Well, with the Rabbanan, you don't even have to have speaking out. That's why it has to be Rab Shimon, because a good Rab Shimon speaking out makes the difference between the deal or the not the deal. According to Rabbanan, says Ravina, speaking out doesn't matter. the Rabbanan would agree that you can renege even if you didn't speak out because Mos ain't a Kona. So that's the chap here. So now, so that's kind of where we are. That it seems that Rav Papa would have to hold like Rav Shimon that Mos is Kona. Amalei. So now Rav Papa says back to Ravina, Ahmed Amar Rav Shimon. You know what? I don't agree. In other words, this engagement now, discussion between Ravina and Rav Papa is you want to pin me and say that I have to hold like Rav Shimon. Ahmed Amar Rav Shimon. Now we're going to introduce a different concept. Remember, the Gemara, in its wisdom, doesn't always accept face value what our discussion is. And you'll see why in a minute. Because now there is another way to interpret Reb Shimon, which we haven't even thought about. This is totally not what we thought about.
So this was basically,
what's that?
We're going through a scenario that took place.
Right.
That this was a back and forth.
This was a back and forth between Rav
continuous
Papa and
discussion.
Rav Shimon. Exactly.
Yeah.
Ravina said to Rav Papa, "Oh, you hold like Rav Shimon. I understand because wait a minute." So Rav Papa says, "No,
No.
I don't necessarily hold like Rav Shimon. Ahmed Amar Rav Shimon. You can argue and say that Rav Shimon says that Mos Kone bechad tarte." When there's a specific price, it's $100, let's say, for the item, specific price. Then Rab Shimon says Mos Kone because the deal is final. It's unequivocal. It's $100. But listen to this: betray tare mi omar. But if the item when you bought it was in a down market and you paid 100, but you knew the market would change because diamonds were becoming cheaper than they were. So you can't say with 100%, but you can say it's a down market. I know, okay, I'm paying $100 today, but I know that market is going to be $75 in a week. So if it's tarte, right? Betray tare mi omar. Does Rab Shimon say that Mos Kona when there is a down market? No. When there's a down market, then he gets a mishapara. But you can't hold him to the deal if you knew going in it was a down market. That's why I say this is a chiddush from left field. How do you know? Rav Papa is saying, how do you know Rab Shimon says Mos Kona? I know Rab Shimon says Mos Kona when there's one price. But when there's a price that's about to change, and you know it's about to change, but it hasn't changed yet. So today's price is $100. I'm paying 100, but I know that it may change. It's almost like the speaking out. I want the best price without speaking out, right? Because you haven't spoken out. So, but you know it's going to change. Then Rav Papa says even Rav Shimon would agree that Mos ain't a Kona and you get a Mishapara. So you can't pin on me that I have to hold like Rav Shimon. I can even hold like the Rabbanan. It seems to me that it looks like Rav Shimon. No, Rav Shimon is also differentiating between whether or not there is one price or two prices. So now we're back to square one. Who does Rav Papa hold like? Does he hold like Rav Shimon or does he hold like the Rabbanan? Because if he holds like the Rav Shimon with that exclusion, then that's okay. So that's a gewaldige Zach that we see now that this is what bends the mind when you learn this is because we're trying to split another difference in Rav Papa by saying that he doesn't have to hold like Rav Shimon because there are two potential prices. Okay. And Rav Papa goes further, and he wants to say it has to be that way that Reb Shimon says that. The e lo tema hachi, because if you don't say that Reb Shimon makes a difference between whether it's a solid price or a price that's going down in the market, then mishapora belokeach Reb Shimon lesle. I'll show you that that's correct because if you don't say that, then there's never. Remember, Rav Papa said, in answer to his question about the machlokes, he said, oh no, I mean mishapara. That if the seller backs out, the seller does the mishapara. If the buyer backs out, the buyer does the mishapara. That's what Rav Papa said. So Rav Papa is saying that if you don't say what I'm saying, that Rav Shimon has two different views, then mishapara belokeach Rav Shimon Leslie. You never have a situation, according to Rav Shimon, where the buyer makes a mishapara. Because if the buyer is the one who's at fault, who's the one who's the reneging, then again, it has to be two prices. If it isn't two prices, then according to that, the buyer will never have a situation to make a mishapara. He'll always be locked in. Because why? Because there's one price. And according to Reb Shimon, one price, that's it. The deal is done. You can never renege. If you can't renege, then how can the lokeach ever renege? And you're going to say, oh, it was a deal. He makes a mishapara. Mishapara never happens according to Rav Shimon, says Rav Papa, according to Rav Shimon, mishapara never happens if it's the buyer who wants to back out, because there's always, the deal is done because Mo's Kona. So it's a brilliant chap here that Rav Papa is trying to undo what Ravina is saying, that you have to hold like Rav Shimon. No, we see there's a difference. V'chi tema, and if you're going to say hachinami, okay, so what's the big deal if you can't have a mishapara according to Lekeach, right? So what's the big deal? Mishapara is only if the seller backs out, and doesn't work if the buyer backs out. Who says that the mishapara has to be equal between the buyer and the seller? That's what he's asking him. You're telling me that if you hold like Reb Shimon, then there's no mishapara by the lokeach. Okay, so there's no mishapara by the lokeach. V'shteit, where does it say that there has to be a mishapara by the lokeach? Says the Gemara. V'hotanya, I'll show you. We learned in a brisa, which is the brisa? That's our brisa back in the beginning of the Gemara, in Memches, okay? The Brisa in Memches, there was a machlokes between the Chachamim and Reb Shimon, and what does the Gemara say there? That if it's not in writing, you shouldn't back out. Mikol makom kach halacha. The Gemara there says these words, Mikol makom kach halacha, that the halacha is that the deal is solid. Reb Shimon saying, "Mikol makom kach halacha, aval amru chachamim mishapara." But the rabbis were the ones who introduced the mishapara. In other words, in the machlokes between Reb Shimon and the Rabbanan, which we had back in Memches, Reb Shimon said, "No, the deal is done. You cannot, if you negotiate the deal and you make the deal is done." It's the Rabbanan who introduced this concept of mishapara, that you can back out of the deal because Mos ain't a kona. Remember that's the machlokas, Mos kona or not. Shimon says Mos kona, deal is solid, unequivocal. Chachamim come along and say, oh no, Mos ain't a kona, but it doesn't pass. So you have a mishapara. You get a mishapara. But notice the words. The words of the Gemara was mikol makom kach halacha, that according to Reb Shimon, even though Reb Shimon understood the concept of mishapara, he didn't accept it. He said that Mos is kona, so unequivocally you have to stay in the deal. You can't get out of the deal. Frek the Gemara now, my mikol makom. What did Reb Shimon mean when he said, Mikol makom, you can't get out of the deal? Lav, didn't he mean to say, the loshona lokeach, loshona moiche, that there is no difference between the buyer and the seller, mekabel alei mishapara, that you can be mekabel a mishapara. So you're wanting to tell me that Reb Shimon says ironclad, that if the money is exchanged and money is koneh, you can't back out. Only the Chachamim say mishapara. He wants to interpret that by the lashon of the Gemara there, which says Mikol Makom Kach Halacha, then he is meaning to say that, okay, halacha is that the buyer and the seller are equal, they're solid. But that's not the case, right? Because we know that the seller can still back out and then he gets a mishapara. And you want to tell me that according to Reb Shimon, there's never a mishapara, but we're saying mikol makom kach halacha, that the buyer and the seller are equal. And if they're equal and one can get a mishapara, then how can you say the other can't mishapara? Now, you're going to say he can't get mishapara because money is kona. But his money is kona for the seller too, and he can get a mishapara, then why can't the buyer get a mishapara? So it isn't ironclad that the buyer is stuck. So you want to exclude and say you can't hold like Reb Shimon because of the question of mishapara. That's not true. Even according to Reb Shimon, the buyer can get a mishapara even though money is kona, because the Gemara says this is the halacha, and when it says this is the halacha, it means it's a universal halacha, so that the buyer and the seller have to be the same. It isn't one halacha for the buyer and one halacha for the seller. They both have to be the same. And if they have to be the same, then you see that there is a mishapara by the buyer. Why are you saying there is not? Ella, so Rav Papa says, Ki Kama Rab Shimon. Now we're going to interpret Rab Shimon. Ki Kama Rab Shimon. When does Rab Shimon say that that the buyer can't get out? Bechad tara. When there's one price, then he unequivocally means you can't get out. Betray tare. But in the case of two prices, um, even Rab Shimon is going to agree that a mishapara applies, even though Mo is kona, and it's airtight. I'm only going to say that when there's one price. But since I introduced the concept of a down market, when there's a down market, then everybody, he's saying, has in mind, oh, maybe the price will go down and I won't have to pay the higher price. And therefore, there is a mishapara. Okay, so this kind of ends that discussion. There's one little caveat which we have. Let's try to just get this in before the Mishnah. So basically, right now, we're saying this concept of two prices will allow Reb Shimon the wiggle room to say that even though Mo's Kona, you can still get out with a Mishapara. Mishapara is no small thing, but it's not a hard and fast deal where the guy can say sorry and walk away. No, you can't walk away because I'm willing to accept the Mishapara, but you have to give me my money back. So now, final piece. Omalei Rav Acha Berei Rava Rav Ashi. So the Gemara now wants to say, so the Chara, everything is good with Rav Papa because he can hold like either Rav Shimon or Rabbanan. Not so fast. So Rav Acha Berei Rav Ashi says, you know what? I still have a problem with Rav Papa. Why? V'tepik lei, because you know why? That there is no misapara, according to Rav Papa, the shaliach shavia miikara. There is no raya from our case that that he is saying we're talking about mishapara. Why? Because he's casting the facts of this case, and again, the Gemara is doing this to kind of. It's amazing because right now we're okay. Rav Papa can hold like either one. We don't know, but it's fine. He says no, it's not okay because when Rav Papa says that about a mishapara, the shaliach shavia miikara. What happened here? You had a son-in-law who was buying for his father-in-law's dowry. So who was the negotiator? The son-in-law.
Yeah.
Who was he buying it for? The father-in-law. Who backed out? The father-in-law. So the facts of this case, according to this interpretation, is that the son-in-law bought and the father-in-law wants to take advantage of the better price. Not the son-in-law, not the one who bought it, who's now coming back to the seller and saying, "Give me my money back." It's the father-in-law, a third party, who's coming back and saying, "I don't accept the shlichus. I don't accept the shlichus." So in that case, that's a whole different fact situation than what Rav Papa is talking about. Rav Papa is talking about Mishapara. What Mishapara?
So
The,
the
the, the,
seller
the
is
father-in-law
saying,
doesn't have to make Mishapara. He said, "I don't accept what my father-in-law did."
Mhm.
So Amalei Rav Ashi, so Rav Ashi then said, "No, you can't slug up Rav Papa. Why? Betagra de Zavin and Mizabin. Because your facts are not correct. Why? The son-in-law was a merchant dealing in diamonds and jewelry, whatever it was, whatever he bought for the dowry. He was a separate businessman. He was the one who was buying and selling, and he was going to buy it, and then he was going to sell it to the father-in-law because the father-in-law wanted to give it for the dowry. So let's say the son-in-law went, he bought it for $100, and he was now going to resell it to the father-in-law for $100. He wasn't going to make any money on it, but because the father-in-law wanted to put it into the dowry. So now we're back to square one. It isn't the father-in-law who wants to back out. It's the son-in-law who wants to back out because he wasn't a shliach for the father-in-law. He was himself a buyer and seller of the item, right?
he's
So
just
since he
stepped into
wasn't
the
a
scene.
shliach for the father-in-law, it's he who is the one who's backing out. So now we're back to square one that we can say you can hold like the Rabbanan or you can hold like Reb Shimon, except that when there are two prices, when the price is about to go down, then even money, which is hard and fast Kenyan, allows someone to back out with the Mishapara. So that's the end of the Gemara. So this is a fascinating piece of Gemara because what it really does is you know, I went over this Gemara a number of times because each time I went over it, something else came up that said this
So,
really it's hard for me to get my hands around it.
so if the son-in-law showed up earlier in this whole Gemara,
Right, right. He only came at the last moment. But where do you get this chap of the son-in-law was a separate merchant? Again, this is how the Gemara operates. So you can't ask the kasha because the Gemara wants a certain outcome. And the Gemara wants to show us the outcome that Rav Papa can hold like Rabbanan or like Rav Shimon. You want him to hold like the Rabbanan? No way. Now you want him to hold like Rav Shimon, and it's ironclad he's holding like Rav Shimon. Nope, not like Rav Shimon either, because there's an out. Comes the Gemara and says, "No, I'm going to show you that he has to hold like Rav Shimon because of the father-in-law situation." And for the Gemara, no, no raya because the son-in-law was a separate merchant. So you have to really sort of probably rethink this whole thing, this to get the appreciation of what this Gemara is really trying to tell us. So with this, we finish this sugya of what's the point? The point is at the end of the day, there's no ribbis. In other words, we're still missing. We have a fascinating story, but it's all about the ribbis aspect as to whether or not you can engage in this because of ribbis. So at the end of the day, the Gemara is saying, no, you can't. There's no ribbis problem. You don't have to get into the ribbis situation. So with this, we end this segment of the Gemara. Mitzvah next week, we're going to start a new Mishnah. But this was a fascinating way to end the sugya. So I hope
I
everyone.
want to put the son-in-law back into the story earlier.
Right,
It
right.
would, it would,
But that's why, Jay, when you asked the question, I didn't want to get ahead of
yeah,
ourselves
yeah.
because sure, everybody thinks about a better price. That's natural to us. We always think about a better price. So we wanted to answer that when you pay money and money is kona, you no longer think of a better price because I'm a Yid, and a Jew doesn't renege on a deal.
Yeah.
And if the deal was
You,
solid, as
well,
if
you're
I made a
committed with the
Mashicha,
money. When you
if
pay the money, you're committed. That's
you're
it.
committed, just like you make a Mashicha, you're committed.
Yeah.
Right? So even though, oh, I could have had a better deal, says the Gemara, Chaval, you didn't have a better deal because you made a deal. So in other words, we're trying to say a deal is not a deal until it's a deal.
Yeah.
When is it a deal? So anyway, that's in our blood. So now we understand why why we act the way we do, because I guess a deal is never over. So